The flashbulbs didn't just pop, they exploded like fireworks, blinding everyone on the red carpet. Alexander Kensington stood there, a smirk plastered across his face, his arm tightly wrapped around a woman who was definitely not his wife. He thought the night belonged to him. He thought parading his young mistress, Sienna, in front of the world's most ruthless press was a power mover, declaration that he was untouchable. He didn't realize that in the shadows, watching the live feed with a glass of vintage Pinot Noir, his wife Victoria was waiting. She wasn't crying, she was calibrating. And when she finally stepped into the light, the silence that followed would be louder than any scream. The atmosphere inside the grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel was thick enough to choke on. It was the annual Titans Gala, the single most important night for New York's elite, where billionaires measured their worth not in stocks, but in the exclusivity of their company. Alexander Kensington adjusted his bespoke tuxedo jacket, the silk lapels catching the chandelier light. At 45, he was the picture of virile success. As the CEO of K-Corp, a conglomerate that had swallowed 3 smaller tech firms in the last quarter alone, he walked with the swagger of a man who believed gravity was a suggestion, not a law. But tonight, the whispers weren't about his stock prices. They were about the woman hanging off his arm. Sienna Miller was 23, stunning in a way that felt almost aggressive. She wore a dress of crimson silk that left very little to the imagination, a sharp contrast to the understated elegance usually expected at the Titans. She beamed at the cameras, her hand resting possessively on Alexander's chest. "Alex, darling, look over there," Sienna cooed, pointing toward a cluster of photographers from the Times. "They can't get enough of us." "They love a winner, Sienna," Alexander replied, his voice a low rumble of arrogance. "And tonight, we are winning." The crowd parted for them, but not out of respect. It was the kind of parting reserved for a car crash. Eyes darted back and forth. Lips moved behind champagne flutes. The scandalous nature of it wasn't just that Alexander had a mistress half the men in the room did, it was that he had brought her here, to the Titans, the one event where spouses were mandatory. Victoria Kensington, his wife of 20 years, was nowhere to be seen. "Where is she?" whispered distinctively raspy voice of Beatrice van der Hoven, the doyenne of Manhattan socialites, leaning into her husband's ear. Surely he didn't leave Victoria at home while he paraded this child around. "I heard they're separated," her husband muttered, eyeing Alexander warily. "Rumor is Alex is pushing for a quick divorce. Wants to rebrand K-Corp as a youthful, edgy empire. Victoria doesn't fit the new image." Beatrice scoffed, taking a sip of her drink. "Victoria built that image. He's a fool if he thinks he can erase her." Across the room, Alexander was reveling in the attention. He introduced Sienna to investors, to rivals, even to the senator. He was flaunting her. It was the calculated humiliation of the woman who wasn't there. He wanted the world to know that the old era was over. Victoria, with her quiet books and her charity galas, was the past. Sienna, vibrant and loud, was the future. "Mr. Kensington." A reporter from a tabloid dared to shout from the press line row, "Is it true that Mrs. Kensington will be stepping down from the board?" Alexander paused, flashing a grin that didn't reach his cold blue eyes. He squeezed Sienna's waist. "Let's just say that K-Corp is undergoing a restructuring. We are cutting off the dead weight to let the new growth bloom." The room seemed to drop a few degrees. Dead weight. He had just called the woman who nursed him through his bankruptcy 10 years ago dead weight. Sienna giggled, clearly not grasping the gravity of the insult, or perhaps simply not caring. "Alex is so visionary," she chimed in, her voice shrill against the low hum of the jazz band. But Alexander's confidence wasn't just born of narcissism. It was born of a secure legal strategy. For months, he had been moving assets. He had transferred holdings to shell companies in the Caymans. He had manipulated the board members, promising them exorbitant bonuses once the old guard was ousted. He believed he had stripped Victoria of her leverage. She was, in his mind, a toothless lioness, aging and tired, likely sitting in their Hamptons estate weeping over old photo albums. He checked his Rolex. 8:15 p.m. The keynote speech was in 15 minutes. He was scheduled to announce the merger with Orion Tech, a deal that would make him a billionaire 3 times over. He planned to do it with Sienna by his side. It would be the final nail in the coffin of his marriage. Champagne, Mr. Kensington. A waiter offered. The whole bottle. Alexander laughed, taking a flute for himself and one for Sienna. To the future. To us. Sienna clinked her glass against his. Just then, a commotion rippled through the entryway. It wasn't the frantic popping of flashes this time. It was a hush. A wave of silence that rolled from the back of the room toward the front, extinguishing conversations like a gust of wind blowing out candles. Alexander frowned, turning his head. What is that? Did the mayor arrive? Sienna stood on her tiptoes, trying to see over the heads of the crowd. I don't know. Everyone is stopping. The sea of black tuxedos and designer gowns parted. This time, the parting was respectful. Revent even. Walking through the center of the aisle was not the mayor. It wasn't a celebrity. It was Victoria. But it wasn't the Victoria that Alexander remembered leaving at the breakfast table weeks ago, the one wearing reading glasses and the cardigan. This woman was a monolith. She wore a gown of midnight blue velvet that hugged her figure with terrifying precision. It was modest yet commanding, the fabric absorbing the light rather than reflecting it. Around her neck sat the Kensington sapphires, a necklace Alexander thought was locked in a safe deposit box only he had access to. Her hair, usually pulled back in a loose bun, was cascading in silver blonde waves down her back. She didn't look tired. She didn't look sad. She looked dangerous. I thought you said she wasn't coming. Sienna hissed, her grip on Alexander's arm tightening until her nails dug in. She wasn't supposed to, Alexander muttered, his face paling slightly. She hates these events. She hasn't come to a Titans gala in 5 years. Victoria walked with a slow, deliberate cadence. She didn't look left or right. She didn't acknowledge the whispers or the shocked gasps. Her eyes were locked on the stage, but her path led her directly past Alexander. As she approached, the circle around Alexander widened. People instinctively stepped back, not wanting to be caught in the crossfire. Alexander straightened his spine, his arrogance fighting to regain control. He decided to play the magnanimous husband. He would treat her like a confused guest. Victoria, he said loudly, his voice booming in the quiet hall. He stepped forward, blocking her path. I didn't expect you. You didn't RSVP. Victoria stopped. She stood 3 feet from him. She looked at his shoes, then his chest, and finally she met his shoes, then his chest, and finally she met his eyes. Her expression was unreadable. It was the face of a poker player holding a royal flush. She didn't speak to him. Instead, her gaze drifted slowly to Sienna. Sienna, trying to mimic Alexander's bravado, smirked. Hello, Victoria. Lovely dress. A bit heavy for the season, isn't it? The crowd held its collective breath. Victoria smiled. It was a small, chilling thing. Hello, Sienna. Enjoy the champagne. It's a 1998 Dom Perignon. I believe I bought that case for Alexander's 40th birthday. She paused, her voice smooth as glass. It pairs well with betrayal. Someone in the crowd coughed to cover a gasp. Alexander's jaw tightened. Don't cause a scene, Victoria. Go home. We will discuss the settlement in the morning. Settlement? Victoria repeated, the word rolling off her tongue like a foreign concept. She finally looked at her husband. Oh, Alexander, we aren't here to discuss a settlement. We're here for the merger. The merger? Alexander laughed, a nervous, jagged sound. You have nothing to do with the Orion deal. You're a housewife, Victoria. Go back to the garden. Victoria stepped closer, invading his personal space. For the first time, Alexander noticed she wasn't alone. Flanking her, emerging from the crowd like shadows, were 2 men. One was Simon Bennett, the most feared corporate litigator in New York. The other was a man Alexander didn't recognize, a younger man with sharp glasses and a tablet in his hand. "I'm not going to the garden, Alexander," she whispered, loud enough only for him and Sienna to hear. "I'm going to the podium." "You wouldn't dare," Alexander snarled. "This is my night." "Is it?" Victoria asked softly. She sidestepped him. It was a graceful, fluid motion that left him standing there, foolishly obstructing nothing. She continued her walk toward the stage, Bennett and the mystery man trailing in her wake. The organizer of the event, a nervous man named Mr. Henderson, looked between Alexander and Victoria. Alexander waved his hand frantically, signaling Henderson to stop her. But Henderson, looking at the sheer force of will radiating from Victoria, froze. Alexander watched in horror as his wife ascended the stairs to the stage. The microphone stand waited. "She's going to ruin everything," Sienna squeaked, her confidence evaporating. "Alex, do something. Security." Alexander barked, turning to the nearest guard. "Get her off the stage. She's not on the program." The guard looked at Alexander, then at Victoria, who was now standing center stage, the spotlight hitting her like a divine beam. The guard didn't move. Victoria tapped the microphone. Thump. Thump. The sound echoed through the massive hall, silencing the few remaining whispers. "Good evening," Victoria said. Her voice wasn't shrill or emotional. It was the voice of a CEO addressing shareholders. "I apologize for the interruption. My husband, Alexander, was scheduled to speak next." She gestured down to where Alexander stood, red-faced and trembling with rage. "However," Victoria continued, "there has been a slight change in the leadership structure of K-Corp as of 5,000 p.m. this afternoon, and I felt it was only right that you hear it from the majority shareholder." Alexander's blood ran cold. Majority shareholder. That was impossible. He held 51%. He had checked the numbers this morning. Victoria leaned into the mic, her eyes finding Alexander's across the room. "You see," she said, a small, terrifying smile playing on her lips. "Alexander likes to talk about cutting dead weight. But he forgot one very important rule of business: never mistake silence for ignorance." To understand the magnitude of the silence that fell over the Pierre Hotel, one has to understand the history of the Kensingtons. 25 years ago, Alexander Kensington was not a titan of industry. He was a charismatic but reckless son of a disgraced banker, drowning in debt and bad investments. He had the name, but he didn't have the sense. Victoria, on the other hand, was a Reynolds. The Reynolds family didn't flaunt their wealth. They buried it deep in land, bonds, and trusts. When she met Alexander, she saw potential. She fell in love with his fire, his ambition, but she wasn't blind to his faults. She was the one who quietly paid off his initial debts. She was the one who structured his first successful company, writing the business plan at their kitchen table while he slept. She was the architect. He was the facade. She was the facade. For 2 decades, she played the part he wanted her to play. The supportive wife. She hosted the dinners, charmed the investors' wives, and smoothed over his rough edges. When he made mistakes, she fixed them. When he insulted partners, she sent the apology gifts. She made him feel like a king, and in doing so, she allowed him to forget that she was the kingmaker. The affair with Sienna had started 6 months ago. Victoria knew instantly. A wife always knows. There were the late nights, the sudden interest in the gym, the second phone. But it wasn't the infidelity that broke her. It was the disrespect. He hadn't just cheated. He had gotten sloppy. He bought Sienna a condo using a company account. He took her on trips to Paris during business travel. He was treating Victoria not as a partner, but as a nuisance to be discarded. 3 months ago, Victoria had found the divorce papers Alexander was having drafted. They were brutal. He planned to leave her with the house and a pittance of a stipend, citing a prenuptial agreement they had signed 20 years ago. He thought the prenup was ironclad. He was wrong. Back in the ballroom, Alexander was pushing his way through the crowd, Sienna stumbling behind him. "Cut the mic!" Alexander screamed at the sound technician. "Cut it now!" The technician looked at Alexander, then looked at the text message he had just received from the hotel owner. He left the fader up. Victoria watched her husband's frantic approach with the detachment of a scientist observing a rat in a maze. "Please, everyone, take your seats," Victoria commanded. And they did. Even the senator sat down. "As I was saying," Victoria continued, her voice steady, "my husband believes that K-Corp is his creation. But memory is a fickle thing." Alexander reached the base of the stairs. "Victoria, get down here. You are embarrassing yourself. You're drunk." Victoria looked down at him. "Am I?" She signaled to the young man with the tablet, the one Alexander didn't recognize. His name was Leo, a forensic accountant Victoria had hired 3 months ago. Leo tapped his tablet. The massive projection screen behind Victoria, which was displaying the K-Corp logo, flickered. Suddenly, a document appeared on the screen. It was a scan of a contract. "Does this look familiar, Alexander?" Victoria asked. Alexander squinted. "It was the original incorporation deed for K-Corp. It's the founding document," Alexander shouted. "So what? It has my signature. Look at clause 14, Victoria said. The image zoomed in. Clause 14. In the event of a merger, acquisition, or restructuring valued over $100 million, the silent partner retains veto power and the option to convert Class B non-voting shares into Class A voting shares at a 2-1 ratio." The room gasped. "Silent partner," Alexander stammered. "There is no silent partner. That was just legal jargon for the trust." "The Reynolds Trust," Victoria corrected him. "My trust." Victoria corrected him. "My trust." She paused, letting the reality sink in. "You see, Alexander, when you needed that seed money 20 years ago, my father didn't just give it to you. He loaned it to me, to invest in you. You signed this document. You were so eager to get the cash, you didn't even read the fine print." Alexander felt the floor swaying. He remembered that day. He had been so desperate. Victoria had handed him the papers, and he had signed them, kissing her, telling her she was his savior. He had never looked at them again. "For 20 years, Victoria said, addressing the crowd. "I have held those Class B shares. I let Alexander run the company. I let him take the credit. Because we were a team." Her eyes hardened. "But a team requires loyalty. And since Alexander has decided to dissolve our partnership personally, I have decided to exercise my rights professionally. "You can't do this," Alexander screamed, his voice cracking. "I own 51%. "You did," Victoria said calmly. "Until this morning. At 9 a.m., I invoked Clause 14. My Class B shares converted. As of right now, I own 60% of K-Corp." A camera flashed, then another, then a storm of them. Alexander stood frozen. 60%. She had majority control. She owned him. "And as the majority shareholder," Victoria said, her voice ringing like a bell, "I have some concerns about the proposed merger with Orion Tech. Specifically, the kickbacks being funneled into offshore accounts under the name Sienna Holdings." The screen changed again. This time, it showed bank transfers. Wire transfers from K-Corp accounts to a shell company in the Cayman Islands. The crowd turned to look at Sienna. Sienna's face went white. I didn't know," she stammered, backing away from Alexander. "He told me it was just a gift. He said it was legal." "It is embezzlement," Victoria said simply. "And it is fraud." She looked at the senator in the front row. "I believe the authorities have already been notified. They are waiting in the lobby." Alexander looked around wildly. He saw the doors open. Police officers, accompanied by federal agents, were stepping into the ballroom. "No," Alexander whispered. "No, this is a mistake. Victoria, please." He looked up at her, pleading. The arrogance was gone. The swagger was gone. The swagger was gone. All that was left was a frightened man who realized he had built his castle on sand. "Victoria, baby," he tried, his voice trembling. "We can talk about this. Don't do this to me. Not here." Victoria looked at him from her high perch. For a moment, her eyes softened, remembering the man he used to be. But then she looked at Sienna, shivering in her red dress, and the softness vanished. "You flaunted her, Alexander," Victoria said, her voice amplified through the speakers, ensuring every soul in the room heard. "You brought your mistress to my table. You tried to erase me. You wanted the spotlight." She stepped back, gesturing to him with an open hand. "Take it. It's all yours." Victoria turned and walked off the stage, disappearing behind the velvet curtains as the police moved toward Alexander, and the flashbulbs erupted into a frenzy of chaos. The only thing Alexander could hear was the clicking of her heels fading away. He was the center of attention, just as he had wanted. But silence had fallen over his life, and the darkness was closing in. The chaos that consumed the Pierre Hotel ballroom was unlike anything the New York social scene had witnessed in decades, as two uniformed officers escorted Alexander Kensington through the sea of overturned chairs and shattered champagne flutes. The silence that Victoria had commanded broke into a cacophony of shouts. "Mr. Kensington, did you steal the money? Is Sienna Miller involved? Victoria, Mrs. Kensington." A comment for the Post. Alexander, his wrists bound in industrial-grade zip ties because the officers had run out of handcuffs during the initial sweep of his security team, looked frantic. His eyes darted around the room searching for an ally. He saw faces he had known for 20 years, men he had played golf with at Augusta, women he had charmed at charity auctions. None of them met his gaze. They looked at their phones, they looked at the floor, or worst of all, they looked at the floor, or they looked at him with undisguised pity. "Sienna!" Alexander shouted, spotting the crimson dress near the exit. "Call my lawyer! Call Bennett!" Sienna Miller was not calling anyone. She was currently being shielded by a hotel staff member, weeping theatrically into a napkin while a detective spoke to her in hushed tones. She didn't look back at Alexander. When his voice boomed her name, she flinched, shrinking away as if physically struck. It was a performance worthy of an Academy Award, and the cameras ate it up. The narrative was already shifting. The powerful tycoon and the manipulated young girl. Victoria did not watch the arrest. She had already exited through the kitchen service doors, guided by her security detail. She sat in the back of her silver Maybach, the tinted windows shielding her from the strobe light effect of the paparazzi swarming the hotel loading dock. "To the penthouse, Mrs. Kensington?" her driver asked. "No," Victoria said, leaning her head back against the leather seat. She felt an exhaustion so deep it settled in her marrow. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind the dull ache of a heart that had broken years ago and was only now being surgically removed. "Take me to the St. Regis. I've booked a suite under my maiden name. I don't want to be at the apartment when the police execute the search warrant." Beside her, Leo, the young forensic accountant, was typing furiously on his tablet. "The initial press release has gone out," Leo reported, his voice devoid of emotion. "K-Corp stock dropped 12% in after-hours trading, but it's stabilizing. The board has received the emergency summons for 8 a.m. tomorrow. We've locked Alexander out of the mainframe. His keycards are deactivated. His company credit cards are frozen." "And the personal accounts?" Victoria asked, closing her eyes. "The joint accounts were frozen by the court order this afternoon," Leo confirmed. "He has access to maybe $2,000 in cash in his wallet. Everything else is tied up in the assets we seized." Victoria nodded. "Good. He'll need cash for the vending machines. Yet. Good, he'll need cash for the vending machines." Alexander spent the night not in his penthouse overlooking Central Park, but in a holding cell at the 19th Precinct. The suit that had cost $6,000 was now wrinkled and smelled of sweat and the cheap disinfectant used to mop the precinct floors. He had demanded his phone call. He had called Simon Bennett. "I'm sorry, Alex." Bennett's voice had been cool, professional, and terrifyingly distant. "I represent K-Corp, As of this evening, K-Corp is the plaintiff in a fraud case against you. I cannot represent you. It would be a conflict of interest. I and K-Corp. Alexander had screamed into the receiver. Not anymore, Bennett replied. You should call a public defender, or perhaps check the yellow pages. I have to go. Mrs. Kensington has called a board meeting. The line went dead. Alexander sat on the metal bench, his head in his hands. It was a nightmare. It had to be. Victoria didn't have this in her. She was soft. She was the woman who cried during Kodak commercials. She was the woman who forgave him when he forgot their 10th anniversary. How had she orchestrated a coup of this magnitude without him seeing a single ripple in the water? He thought of Sienna. Surely she was fighting for him. She loved him. They were going to travel the world. She would find a way to get him bail, but when morning came and Alexander was finally allowed to meet with a lawyer, a frantic, disheveled man named Arthur Pym, whom Alexander had hired through a friend of a friend, the news was grim. The bail hearing is set for 10 a.m., Pym said, shuffling papers that he clearly hadn't read thoroughly. The DA is pushing for a high amount. Flight risk. I'm not a flight risk, Alexander snapped. I have a company to run. Pym grimaced. About that, have you seen the morning news? Pym slid a tablet across the metal table. On the screen was a video of Sienna Miller. She was standing on the steps of the precinct, wearing a modest grey sweater and no makeup. She looked young, vulnerable, and utterly broken. I had no idea. Sienna sobbed into the microphones. Mr. Kensington told me he was divorced. He told me the money was his. He said he wanted to help me start my fashion line. I didn't know it was stolen from the company. I'm just a victim here. I'm cooperating fully with the district attorney. Alexander stared at the screen. That lying little witch. She's cut a deal, Pym said, taking the tablet back. She gave them your private laptop. The one you kept at her condo. Alexander felt the blood drain from his face. The laptop. It contained everything. The unencrypted emails, the offshore ledgers, the plans to liquidate Victoria's family estate to fund the Orion merger. We need to get bail, Alexander whispered, his voice trembling. I need to get out of here. Bail is set at $5 million, Pym said. Cash. Fine. Write the check. Your accounts are frozen, Mr. Kensington. Pym reminded him gently. You don't have $5 million. You don't have $500. Alexander slumped back. For the first time in his life, he was truly, completely powerless. While Alexander was being arraigned in a dingy courtroom, the atmosphere in the K-Corp boardroom on the 40th floor of the Kensington Tower was electric, but controlled. The boardroom was a masterpiece of intimidation, a long table of mahogany, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, and portraits of past CEOs lining the walls. The portrait of Alexander, commissioned just last year, had already been removed. In its place hung a portrait of Victoria's father, the founder. 12 board members sat around the table. Most of them were men. Alexander had hand-picked sycophants who rubber-stamped his decisions in exchange for lavish retreats and stock options. Today they looked like schoolboys waiting for the principal. At the head of the table, where Alexander usually sat, stood Victoria. She was wearing a white power suit, crisp and sharp. She didn't look tired, she looked invigorated. The transformation from the silent wife to the corporate executioner was complete. Gentlemen, Victoria began, not sitting down. And Mrs. Gable. She nodded to the lone female board member, a woman who had often tried to warn Alexander about his spending, only to be silenced. Thank you for coming on such short notice. Victoria, started Thomas Grady, the CFO and Alexander's closest ally on the board. He was sweating profusely. This is highly irregular, the bylaws state. The bylaws, Victoria interrupted, sliding a thick folder across the polished wood, states that any executive officer engaged in criminal activity that damages the company's reputation can be removed immediately without a vote. Clause 7, Section C. Grady swallowed. Alleged criminal activity. There is nothing alleged about the wire transfers you authorized, Thomas. Victoria said softly. The room went deathly silent. Victoria pressed a button on the remote in her hand. The smart screen at the end of the room illuminated. It showed an email chain between Alexander and Thomas Grady. Subject: the Cayman transfer from A. Kensington to T. Grady. Body: just move the funds. Victoria won't notice. She never looks at the operational accounts. Use the consulting fees code. We need that condo for Sienna by Friday. Grady's face turned the color of ash. You authorized $7 million in company funds to buy a Mistress, a luxury apartment, Victoria said, her voice rising just enough to cut through the air like a knife. And you listed it as IT infrastructure consulting. Alexander ordered me to, Grady stammered. He's the CEO. I work for him. You work for the shareholders, Victoria corrected him. And as the majority shareholder, I am accepting your resignation, effective immediately. You can't just fire me. Grady stood up, blustering. You're right, Victoria said. I can't just fire me. You're right, Victoria said. I can't just fire you. I can also prosecute you. The FBI is currently in your office, Thomas. They're seizing your hard drives. If you leave now, you might catch them before they bag your golf clubs. Grady looked at the door, then back at Victoria. He didn't say another word. He grabbed his briefcase and fled the room. Victoria watched him go, then turned her gaze to the remaining members. Now, she said, smoothing the lapel of her jacket, who else would like to explain their complicity in my husband's looting of this company? Silence. Absolute, terrified silence. Good, Victoria said, finally taking her seat at the head of the table. Then, let's get to work. First order of business, we are cancelling the Orion merger. But Victoria, interjected another board member, a man named Philip, the market expects that merger. If we pull out, the stock will tank. The Orion merger, Victoria said, looking at Leo, who was standing by her side, was a Trojan horse. Alexander wasn't buying Orion for their tech. He was buying it to bury debt. Orion is insolvent. If we merged, K-Corp would have been dragged down with them within 6 months. She projected the due diligence report, the real one, not the doctored one Alexander had shown the board. Alexander was going to bankrupt this company, Victoria stated. He was going to cash out his stock options, divorce me, leave me with the wreckage, and run off to the Mediterranean with his girlfriend. That was the plan. The board members exchanged horrified looks. They had been so blinded by the soaring stock prices they hadn't looked at the fundamentals. We are going to rebuild, Victoria announced. We are going back to basics. No more flash. No more celebrity CEO. We are going to make products that work, and we are going to operate with transparency. And if anyone here has a problem with that, the door is open. No one moved. Excellent, Victoria said. Item number 2. We need to issue a statement regarding Mr. Kensington's bail. What statement? Philip asked. We should distance ourselves. No, Victoria said, a small cold smile touching her lips. We need to ensure he doesn't get it. D. Ensure he doesn't get it. D. Back at the precinct, Alexander was meeting with his new reality. I called everyone, Alex, Pym said, looking defeated. I called the Hamptons crew. I called the poker guys. I even called your brother in London. And, Alexander asked, gripping the edge of the table, your brother said, well, he said you owe him £40,000 from 2015 and hung up. The others, no one wants to touch this. The Senna Holdings thing is toxic. It's not just fraud. The press is spinning it as you stealing from your wife's family legacy to pay for a girl young enough to be your daughter. It's a PR nightmare. What about the house? Alexander asked. The estate? Victoria changed the locks, Pym said, and the deed is in the trust. You can't leverage it. Alexander felt a surge of pure, unadulterated rage. She had thought of everything. She had systematically dismantled his life before he even knew the war had started. So I'm stuck here, Alexander rasped, in this cage, until the trial, Pym said apologetically. or until you can come up with 5 million cash. Just then, the heavy steel door of the interview room opened. A guard stepped in. "Visitor for you, Kensington." Alexander perked up. Maybe one of his friends had come through. Maybe Sienna had a change of heart. But the person who walked in was neither friend nor lover. It was a man Alexander recognized from the society pages, but had never personally dealt with. Maxwell Sterling? No, that was the old guard. This was Julian Vance. No, wait. Victoria had banned those names from his memory. This man was Elias Thorne. No. It was Sebastian Cross, a fixer, a man who specialized in reputation management for the ultra-wealthy, but of the darker variety. He wasn't a lawyer, he was a weapon. "Mr. Kensington," Cross said, his voice like gravel wrapped in silk. He wore a suit that cost more than Alexander's first car. He wouldn't sit down. "Who are you?" Alexander asked. "Did Pym hire you?" Pym looked nervous. "I didn't hire anyone. I am here on behalf of a third party," Cross said. "Someone who believes that your wife's aggressive takeover sets a dangerous precedent." Alexander's eyes narrowed. "Who, let's just say, enemies of the Reynolds family, business rivals who would prefer K-Corp not return to the conservative management of Victoria Reynolds." Cross placed a briefcase on the table. "Inside this case is a check for $5 million. It is a loan, interest-free." Alexander stared at the case. It was a lifeline. "What's the catch?" Alexander asked. "The catch," Cross said, leaning in, his eyes dark and intense, "is that you don't plead guilty. You fight. You drag this out. You make this the messiest, ugliest divorce and corporate trial in New York history. You destroy Victoria's reputation. You paint her as unstable, vindictive, perhaps even mentally incompetent." "She is vindictive," Alexander spat. "Good," Cross smiled. "We can work with that. We will fund your defense. We will hire the best sharks in the city, but you must follow our instructions. We are going to burn her image to the ground." Alexander looked at the briefcase. Then he thought of Victoria standing on that stage, looking down at him. He thought of the humiliation. The cell. He reached out and put his hand on the briefcase. "Where do I sign?" Alexander asked. Cross slid a single sheet of paper forward. "Right here. Welcome to the resistance, Mr. Kensington." As Alexander signed his name, he didn't realize he wasn't signing a loan agreement. He was signing a pact with devils far worse than the ones he knew, and Victoria, sitting in her high tower, had no idea that while she had won the battle, the war was about to turn nuclear. The release of Alexander Kensington on bail was the match that lit the fuse of a media firestorm. When he walked out of the precinct, flanked by Sebastian Cross and a team of high-priced bodyguards, he didn't look like a defeated man. He looked like a martyr. Sebastian Cross had done his work well. Within hours of the release, the narrative began to shift. It was subtle at first, a few blog posts questioning the timing of Victoria's takeover, a few tweets suggesting that perhaps the silent partner clause was a entrapment scheme. But by the next morning, the floodgates had opened. The New York Chronicle ran a headline, "The Ice-Cui-En Comith. Did Victoria Kensington frame her husband to steal an empire?" Inside the article, anonymous sources paid for by Cross's shadowy backers painted a picture of a marriage that was very different from reality. They claimed Victoria was controlling, paranoid, and obsessed with power. They alleged that she had known about the Sienna affair for months and had encouraged it, using it as leverage to manipulate Alexander into bad business deals so she could swoop in as the savior. It was a lie. But it was a complicated lie, and the public loves a complicated lie more than a simple truth. Victoria sat in her suite at the St. Regis, watching the news with a stony expression. "They're using the mad woman in the attic trope," she said, sipping her tea. Her hand didn't shake, but her knuckles were white. "They're trying to say I'm unstable." "It's worse," Leo said, looking up from his tablet. His face was pale. "Look at this." He turned the screen to her. It was a video circulating on social media. It was a deep fake. or at least a heavily doctored audio recording. It sounded like Victoria's voice, but the tone was screeching, hysterical. "I'll destroy him. I'll take every penny. I don't care about the company. I just want him to suffer." The voice screamed. "I never said that," Victoria whispered. "We know," Leo said. "The metadata shows it's spliced from 12 different board meetings and charity speeches, but it's gone viral. 3 million views in 2 hours. The impact was immediate. K-Corp stock, which had stabilized, began to plummet again. Investors were spooked. They didn't want a CEO who was embroiled in a messy, vindictive domestic war. They wanted stability." Alexander, meanwhile, was playing his part to perfection. Under Cross's direction, he gave an exclusive interview to a primetime news anchor. He sat in a borrowed penthouse. His own was still sealed, looking humble and contrite. "I made mistakes," Alexander said to the camera, wiping away a fake tear. "I fell in love with the wrong person. Sienna, she was a mistake. But Victoria, she planned this. She wanted to humiliate me. She doesn't care about the employees or the shareholders. She only cares about revenge." The public ate it up. The Team Alex hashtag started trending. Victoria felt the walls closing in. The board members who had been terrified of her 2 days ago were now calling her, asking clarifying questions about her mental health. Her friends, the women she had lunched with for decades, stopped returning her calls. She was becoming radioactive. "We need to respond," Leo urged. "Let me release the full forensic audit. Let's show them the theft." "Facts are boring, Leo," Victoria said, standing up and walking to the window. She looked out at the city that seemed to be turning its back on her. "They don't want spreadsheets. They want a villain, and Alexander has cast me as the witch." She turned back to him. "Alexander isn't smart enough to do this," she said. "He doesn't know how to splice audio. He doesn't know how to manipulate search engine algorithms. He barely knows how to use his email." "Sebastian Cross," Leo said. "Cross is a tool," Victoria replied. "He's a mercenary. He costs $50,000 a day. Alexander doesn't have 50 cents. Someone is paying Cross. Someone with deep pockets and a grudge." Victoria's eyes narrowed. The despair was gone, replaced by the cold, analytical fury that had built the Reynolds fortune. "Find the money, Leo. Follow the money trail that paid Alexander's bail. It didn't come from a bank. It came from somewhere else." The investigation took 3 days, 3 days of Victoria enduring the jeers of the press whenever she left the hotel. 3 days of K-Corp losing value. 3 days of Alexander preening like a peacock, believing he was winning. But on the 4th night, at 3 a.m., Leo burst into Victoria's suite. He hadn't slept. His eyes were red-rimmed behind his glasses, but he was grinning. "I found it," he breathed. He plugged his tablet into the TV screen. A complex web of wire transfers appeared. Sebastian Cross was paid by a shell company in Panama called Blue Horizon Ventures. Blue Horizon is owned by a trust in Singapore. That trust is managed by a law firm in Zurich. Standard obfuscation, Victoria noted. "Yes," Leo said, "but they made a mistake. A tiny, lazy mistake. A tiny, lazy mistake. The Zurich firm pays the annual filing fees for the Singapore trust using a corporate credit card." He tapped the screen. A name appeared. Gideon Graves. Victoria froze. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Gideon," she whispered. Gideon Graves was the CEO of Omni Systems, K-Corp's largest and most ruthless competitor. But he was more than that. Decades ago, Gideon had been a suitor for Victoria's hand. He had proposed to her before she met Alexander. She had proposed to her before she met Alexander. She had rejected him, sensing a cruelty beneath his polished exterior. Gideon had never forgiven her. He had vowed to destroy the Reynolds legacy. "He's funding Alexander," Victoria realized. "He doesn't want Alexander to win. He wants K-Corp to collapse. He's using the scandal to drive the stock price down so he can buy the company for pennies on the dollar." "Exactly," Leo said. Look at this. Omni Systems has been quietly buying up K-Corp stock every time it dips. They've already acquired 4.9%. If they hit 5%, they have to disclose. They are waiting for one final crash the mental breakdown of Victoria Kensington to buy the controlling stake. Victoria sat down slowly. It was brilliant, and it was evil. Alexander thought he was fighting for his life, but he was actually the suicide bomber Gideon had sent to blow up the castle. Does Alexander know? Leo asked. No, Victoria said softly. Alexander thinks he's the hero. He has no idea he's the sacrifice. She stood up. The fear was gone. The confusion was gone. She knew her enemy now, and she knew exactly how to destroy him. Get me the car, Victoria commanded. Where are we going? To the lion's den, she said. We are going to see Alexander Ander. Victoria didn't go to the press. She didn't go to the police. She went to the safe house where Alexander was staying, a luxury brownstone in the West Village provided by Cross. She didn't knock. She had the security code. Cross had been arrogant. He hadn't changed the codes from the default settings of the security firm K-Corp used. She walked into the living room. Alexander was sitting on the couch, drinking scotch, watching a replay of his interview. He looked up, startled, spilling his drink. Victoria. He scrambled to his feet. How did you... Get out. I'll call the police. I'll call Cross. Sit down, Alexander, Victoria said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of a judge's gavel. You can't order me around anymore, Alexander shouted, though he didn't move toward the phone. I'm winning, Victoria. Everyone knows what you are. What am I, Alexander? She asked, standing in the center of the room. You're a tyrant. You tried to steal my company. It was never your company, she said calmly. But that doesn't matter right now. What matters is that you are being played. I'm not the one being played, Alexander sneered. I have powerful friends, people who believe in me. You mean Gideon Graves? The name hung in the air. Alexander blinked. Who? The man paying Sebastian Cross. The man paying your bail. The man paying for this house. I don't know a Gideon Graves, Alexander said, confused. Cross represents a consortium of investors. Victoria threw a folder onto the coffee table. It landed with a heavy thud. Read it. Alexander looked at her, then at the folder. He hesitated, then reached for it. He opened it. He saw the wire transfers. He saw the emails between Cross and Graves. Subject, the idiot. From G. Graves. Subject, the idiot. From G. Graves to S. Cross. Body. Keep him talking. The more he attacks her, the lower the stock goes. We need it under $10 by Friday. Once the acquisition is complete, cut him loose. I don't care if he goes back to jail. In fact, it's better if he does. No loose ends. Alexander read the email 3 times. His hands began to shake. He calls me the idiot, Alexander whispered. He hates you, Alexander, Victoria said, stepping closer. He hates you because you married me, and he hates me because I rejected him. He is using you to destroy my father's legacy, and once he owns K-Corp, he will strip it for parts. He will fire the employees, he will erase the Kensington name, and he will send you back to prison without a second thought. Alexander looked up. His eyes were wide, filled with a sudden, terrifying clarity. The arrogance stripped away, leaving only the fear of a man who realizes he has dug his own grave. Cross told me. He told me I would be CEO again, Alexander stammered. Cross lied, Victoria said. You have 2 choices, Alexander. You can continue down this path. Gideon will win. K-Corp will die. And you'll spend the next 20 years in Attica. Or, Alexander asked, his voice breaking, or you can help me kill the king. The courtroom was packed for the emergency injunction hearing. Gideon Graves sat in the back row looking smug. He expected Victoria to be flustered, to be on the defensive. He expected Alexander to continue the charade. Victoria walked in. She wore the same midnight blue she had worn at the gala. She looked impeccable. Sebastian Cross stood up. buttoning his jacket. "Your Honor, my client, Mr. Kensington, has evidence that his wife is mentally unfit to run K-Corp. Actually," Alexander's voice cut through the room. Alexander stood up. He wasn't looking at the judge. He was looking at Gideon Graves. "Mr. Cross is fired," Alexander said. A murmur rippled through the court. "Mr. Kensington," the judge warned, "this is highly irregular. I would like to submit new evidence," Alexander said. He walked to the front of the room, ignoring Cross's frantic whispers. He pulled a flash drive from his pocket. "This drive contains recordings of my conversations with Sebastian Cross," Alexander said. "In them, he details the instructions given by his employer, Gideon Graves, to manufacture false evidence against my wife, manipulate the stock market, and commit securities fraud." Gideon Graves' smug expression vanished. He stood up to leave. "Sit down, Mr. Graves," the bailiff barked. Alexander turned to Victoria. For the first time in years, he looked at her with respect. Not love that was dead, but respect. "I am guilty," Alexander told the judge. "I embezzled the money. I had the affair. Victoria is innocent. She is the only person who tried to save the company." The courtroom erupted. The fallout was swift and brutal. Gideon Graves was indicted for stock manipulation and conspiracy. OmniSystems stock crashed, and in a twist of poetic justice, Victoria used K-Corp's recovered capital to buy a controlling stake in OmniSystems during the dip. She didn't destroy it. She absorbed it. Alexander kept his deal. He pleaded guilty to embezzlement. Because of his cooperation in the Graves case, his sentence was reduced. He served 3 years in a minimum security facility. When he got out, Victoria was not there to meet him. She sent a car to take him to a small apartment in upstate New York, paid for by the trust, with a modest monthly allowance. It was more than he deserved, and less than he wanted. Sienna Miller attempted to write a tell-all book, but no publisher would touch it. She faded into obscurity, a footnote in a scandal that people eventually forgot. Victoria Kensington remained at the helm of K-Corp. She never remarried. She didn't need to. She had her empire. She had her legacy. On the 1-year anniversary of the Red Gala, Victoria stood on the balcony of her office, looking out over the city lights. The press still called her the Ice Queen sometimes, but she didn't mind. Ice, after all, is unbreakable. She took a sip of her 1998 Dom Perignon. It tasted sweet. She had learned the most valuable lesson of all. In a world of noise, the person who holds the silence holds the power. And that, my friends, is how you handle a betrayal. Alexander thought he could parade his disrespect in the spotlight, but he forgot that the brightest lights cast the darkest shadows, and that's where Victoria was waiting. She didn't just win the divorce, she won the war, the company, and the narrative. It's a reminder that sometimes the best revenge isn't screaming. It's quietly changing the locks while your enemy is busy celebrating. What would you have done if you were Victoria? Would you have shown Alexander any mercy at the end? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of corporate takedowns and sweet revenge, please smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story. Share this video with a friend who needs a reminder that they are stronger than they think. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.